We'll now proceed to the final session for today, whereby we're going to have a panel session and Q&A session with Professor Tianli Chun, Associate Professor Tianli Chun, Associate Professor Tomoki Fuji, and Associate Professor Walter Teixeira, the final session.
Thank you. Maybe we should open the questions to the floor first. People who are here, we take some questions from you to keep the discussion going, and then we will open up to people who are online. Any questions?
Any questions?
Or else, I shall invoke my privilege as a chair to start the questions. Maybe first question go to Walter, because I'm more familiar with his work. Yeah. His study is very interesting about the social welfare model in Singapore. In my own research, I find that it's sometimes very hard to get the data to fully understand the extent and the role of social expenditure in Singapore. This is because Singapore has a very unique financing model. A lot of the social protection is, as you have mentioned, is in the area of healthcare, housing, retirement, and employment. That is the workfare scheme. All right. In my course of study, I found out that the way we fund our social protection is quite different from the rest of the world, because we are very fond of saving for the future, saving for the unexpected expenditure. So we all know about the reserves, right? So similarly to the structure of reserves, the social protection in Singapore is actually funded through different kind of funds, right? It can be an endowment fund, it can be trust fund. For example, in 2014, when we had the Pioneer Generation Fund, it's a trust fund, and only the return from the trust fund can be used, right? When you talk about healthcare and education, a lot of it is endowment fund, so only return can be spent. A trust fund, you can draw down the capital. Yeah. So in your estimation, for example, do you take into consideration spending from the funds?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, Nichu, because I think it highlights the difficulty of not only comparing social protection systems and expenditure across countries, but also even within a country like Singapore, how do you come up with a measure of that? So the measures I got in that paper are taken straight from the Singapore budget, and the budget rule in Singapore is that it basically, generally speaking, it only counts expenditures which are made from funds available down here, which will either be tax revenue or it will be funds which are made available through the allowable drawdown on net investment return contribution. So if the contribution is actually coming from a defined set aside endowment fund, it doesn't actually have to be counted in the budget data as far as I understand it. So to give you one example, let's talk about ComCare spending, right? So ComCare spending is basically our financial support schemes to low-income Singaporeans who don't qualify under some other scheme like family development or whatever it is. So this is just cash support. And ComCare is partially funded by the ComCare Endowment Fund, by the return from that, and is also partially funded by direct drawdowns from the government budget that year. What I report that is only what is actually voted in the government budget. It does not include the contribution to the ComCare Fund, because there is no consistent way of comparing it across countries. But The Comcare Endowment Fund, I think, addition, if I'm not wrong, it would only effectively more or less about double the share of GDP that it takes up. It's not as if it would, increase it by 10 times or 20 times or something like that. So it's only about 50% paid for by the fund.
Yeah, but the Comcare fund is really quite huge. By 2019, it was around about 17 billion.
Yeah. So we really spend the interest on it.
Yeah,
so,
we spend the interest.
So the measure you look at any given year is the actual expenditure the fund makes rather than, the total amount available. Yeah.
In 2019 budget, if you look at the budget for health, and if you look at the funding from all the funds, like the Medic Fund, Medic Silver Fund, Elder Care Fund, that would increase the government expenditure by $1 billion. So if you include that into the GDP, it will increase the percentage of spending. So I always think that if you just use the budget sources, it will be an underestimation. But if you delve deeper, it may give you a different story.
But I think if I can just add on here, I think that's actually the catch of the problem, right? Which is that the government themselves are not consistent in how they want to measure it. So when the government wants to, for example, talk about the health spending efficiency of Singapore healthcare, they like to push a number as low as possible, and they won't include, in fact, all the other funds we talk about. But if they want to talk about, for example, how much money the government is spending in healthcare to make Singaporeans happy, then they will edit everything. So actually, it's not I would say that we're not consistent about this, which is the problem.
I see.
Yeah.
But do you think that the welfare, the way we spend on welfare is related to government's philosophy? Or that, we try to avoid being a nanny state. But recently, I think, especially DPM, Minister Taman talk about trampoline, talk about the moving escalator. Does that indicate a move, a shift towards welfare spending?
Yeah, I think if you look at the actual policies we've implemented, and then you yourself have done lots of research on this, we can all see quite clearly that there's been a huge increase in welfare programs in Singapore over the past decade especially. And because of the increase in welfare programs, we now cover many of the areas that the so-called traditional welfare state covers anyway. So we've got non-contributory old age pensions, which is social support scheme. We have got income support for federal government. Then this year, just in the last month or so, now we're going to have unemployment insurance, right? Which may well have a significant government payment share. We don't know yet, but it's likely to have. So I'd say that, I think as I said in the talk, it's probably never right to say that Singapore is not a welfare state. It's just that we are trying our best, I think, to couch it in different terms. But when we look at the actual policies, sometimes there's not a lot of differences, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any question from the floor? Any question coming in online? No.
No.
Then I shall ask Chiu. Recently we are facing the impact of the global energy crisis, right? The current crisis came about because of an underestimation of post-pandemic recovery, driving up the pent-up demand. In particular, there was like a swing towards concern on climate change and to have more reduced carbon. So there was an underinvestment in gas, leading to supply disruption. There was also a reduced capital expenditure in fossils, such as coal and oil fuel. This is impacting Singapore in terms of crisis. What is your take on this? How do you see we can navigate out from this crisis? What Singapore should do?
Yeah, so I think, one of the important things to do anyways is to, push for the use of more energy efficient technology. That is something that, pays off in the long run in any case. So if, as you use less, energy, the price impact of energy affects you less, right? So that's one area that I think Singapore definitely needs to work on. Singapore has achieved good efficiency level in terms of energy per GDP, but it doesn't mean that Singapore can stop here. And given that Singapore has a very good institution and the strong government, the social structure can be reorganized in order to use energy more efficiently. So we can think of, say, transportation as an example. You look at the private vehicles. What do? Most of private vehicles stay in the car park for most of the days. It occupies scarce land space. Can we do anything about it? With some coordination, I believe we can. With the use of smart technology, automation, artificial intelligence, these could play an important role. And most private vehicle owners want comfortable transportation, but they don't necessarily want to, create a space for car park. They want to use the space for something else, right? Space is very expensive in Singapore. So, if you can, keep most of the cars on the road, put to good use, then you can increase the efficiency of resources. And Singapore is small, and that has an advantage. You can create infrastructure. Currently, electric vehicles carry heavy batteries. If vehicles take energy from the road, you don't need it. Right? Of course, this cannot be done very easily. It requires massive investment in the infrastructure. Technology is there. In terms of efficiency, I'm not so sure, but with the advancement of technology, these surely pay off. So these are the kind of things that Singapore could potentially think about. And new technology, new model that is created in Singapore can be replicated elsewhere, which in turn creates a competitive advantage for Singapore.
So when you analyze the relationship between health and retirement, I don't see any difference between low income and high income workers.
Yeah, we didn't look at that. We used that as a control, in fact. Yeah. We didn't look at the high income or low income, but we look at occupation, and caste.
So for the low skill occupation, is that health impact is stronger?
Yeah, low skill will be like if low skill is manual, physically demanding, then they tend not to take up the re-employment offers. Yeah. That's a good point, but we didn't look at by income.
Since I guess we're talking about your paper, I do have a question about the re-employment issue, which is that what's the quality of the data like to know what the re-employment offers are like in terms of that basically the terms and so on. I mean, I guess you have got the admin data for income, but what can you see or what can you understand about it? Yeah.
We do have detail on the offer. Yeah, not at all. We use the mandate in 2012 as an instrumental variable. So we can look at people who are treated and non-treated, but we don't look at the quality of the employment offer. Yeah. But for health, the RHS data is linked to the NOH data. So right now we are requesting the RHS data to be linked to HDB to get us data so that we can also look at the monetization option. Yeah. But we don't have the quality of the employment offers. Yeah.
I guess in that case, one could interpret the result as also perhaps partially including maybe differences in the quality of employment offer by industries or by tasks and so on, which could also maybe explain what you're finding as well partially.
But we do not know the quality of the offer, but we do know the workers' or respondents' experience in terms of job satisfaction and the occupation they are in. Yeah. So it's quite hard to infer the employment offer. But what is interesting is the willingness to rejoin. Seems like people who are younger, they are more willing to rejoin. So people who are like between 55 to 65, that was our cutoff. Yeah. At this age group, people tend to be more willing to rejoin the workforce. But once you are older, I think we also saw that people who are older, they tend to have more chronic illnesses compared to those like the newly active people. They had like 1.4 chronic illness. But you look at people who continue to be inactive, they had around about 2 chronic illness. So it's either diabetes, hypertension, things like this. Yeah. But the data is very rich. I think it takes a lot of time to run, and this had to be run in the lab. Yeah. So my 2 research assistants and 1 PhD student, they had to go to the secure lab to run the model. Yeah.
Great. Also want to say more what now because of COVID, so the government actually provide a lot of support for the Singapore household. In that, we think because we have in economics, we have habit formation. Right? In that, we're able to affect the future policy.
So you think about habit formation and future policies?
Right. So basically now, since people need to get some support from the government, right? So in that case, affordable people in back in the future, if anything bad happen to me, I can also look for help from the government.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good point. So I think your concern is about whether the change in policy, maybe as a result of COVID and other things, right? We have a lot more income support and things like that now than we did 2 years ago. I guess your concern is about whether this might somehow change the expectations of households and therefore lead to differences in maybe work effort or job retention and so on. Yeah, it's a very good question actually. I think, okay, so I think, let me see how to think about this. I think what has changed in the last couple of years is actually the expectations of the public for income support for higher income workers. And I think, I don't know whether this directly answers the question, but the narrative I'm going for, you see, is that I think there is a large group of lower income workers in Singapore who have always been somewhat familiar with the welfare system. Familiar with the welfare system doesn't mean that they're always applying for welfare, but what it means is that they generally understand, I think to some level, what are the available sources of help, how to go about applying for help, and for some you might say frequent flyers for help, okay? Those individuals might understand quite well how to get support as soon as possible if something happens to them. But what is, I think, different, right, about the last couple of years is that now you have a much larger group of Singaporeans in the middle income and higher income groups who, because of a combination of COVID or competition from foreign payments or whatever it is, or just job disruption, they're actually encountering unemployment or disruptions in their regular career at a much higher rate than they used to before. Or even if they're not encountering themselves, nowadays they're much more likely to know somebody who something happened to them in the job market. And I think when you have this group who has never before had to actually look for government support and help, I think that's actually what's creating all of this demand today for unemployment support and other kinds of support targeted at middle to higher income Singaporeans. Because this wasn't a concern for them 10 or 20 years ago, where maybe unemployment or job disruption for middle to high income Singaporeans is actually fairly low. But now it's much more of a reality. So I think that is actually what has changed. And I think whether this is good or bad, I think it's a bit hard to say actually. But I do expect that as the government announced, unemployment support and entitlement to these kinds of support will actually become the norm in Singapore. Yeah. So I think that's a change. I don't know whether I answered the question though. I mean, I don't know whether the parameter of, the underlying job search parameter or something, I don't know whether that will change. Yeah, over time. But just more philosophically, right? I guess the question we would really like to answer as economists, I think, is whether the quality of job search and the decisions people make end up being better or more efficient in the presence of, for example, unemployment support and so on. I mean, that's kind of the big question, right? If you have unemployment support, on net, how does it change incentives and to what extent does it, for example, maybe encourage people to look, to get a better match, to find a better matching job, than to just find the next job available. And this is a big question, of course, but I think this is actually the thing that we would like to know more about in order to evaluate whether unemployment in Singapore, unemployment policy, is good or bad. Right? We would like to know more about this. Yeah. But I'm not sure I can think of a good research design or way of estimating that parameter.
Can I perhaps ask one question to
Sure.
I'm just curious to know what you think about whether the concept of retirement age is needed. In certain places, discrimination by age is, outlawed. Now, in Singapore, you have essentially retirement age. Is this something that will continue to be relevant as people live longer, and some of the people actually are really healthy in their 60s, 70s, and 80s?
Good question. I think Walter had spoken about this before. In the Singapore context, actually with a contributory social security system, retirement age is not relevant. Yeah, it's important to some society when they have the defined benefit system because retirement age will be used to determine when you can receive the benefit, right? In our local context with CPF, seems like retirement age is not a main issue. In fact, retirement age is to give security to the workers that they continue to work if they want to work. Yeah. So for people who want to work, retirement age at least is a binding contract that they can look forward to work till retirement age and to get the re-employment offer as well. So the re-employment offer is different from retirement age because the terms of employment can change, but you have the option to take it or not. Yeah. So I think the whole thing about retirement and retirement age in Singapore the legislation is to protect workers more than anything else. Yeah.
I suppose in thinking about this problem a bit more, it also strikes me as being odd in a way that we can't figure out a way to adjust employment contracts in terms of employment more continuously. Because if you look at the retirement and re-employment policy we have in Singapore, the entire point of the policy is to allow employers to more or less adjust the terms of employment for an employee who is older, but in a way that's hopefully kind of fair. But of course, whether it's fair or not can be disputed by the employee. But the whole point is actually to adjust the terms, and often what happens is people come up with terms which are less good than what they were just one day before. right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but the broader issue, of course, is that if we recognize that for many employees, there is a kind of like declining productivity or contribution, whatever that they make after a certain age, then we would argue that what the employment system or what the wage or compensation system really needs to reflect is some kind of continuous way of adjusting for it. But for all sorts of reasons, no system actually does this, right? I mean, like, I can't think of a single employment system anywhere other than a system which pays you on a piece-by basis for everything that you do that actually adjusts for changes in capacity over time. You know, wages are just taking. So, yeah.
That brings us to the point that you raised earlier, whether we look at the quality of the offer, right? That's something to do with our system. Yeah. Kendra?
We have a question from the Zoom, okay, so this question is from Ms. Tracy Tan. This is for Dr. Tessera. Now, Minister Chan has once commented on the complexities of setting a poverty line for Singapore. So how is Singapore so different and complex as compared to other economies that we cannot set this line? So it's open here.
Sure. So the question is about the poverty line and whether you should set it, how do you set it. I guess when you look at many economies, honestly, how you set the poverty line is somewhat arbitrary in most cases. So the typical ways to do it are, you may decide, for example, that the poverty line should be a fraction of the median wage, or should be sitting at some percentile of the distribution of income, right? Of course, if you set the poverty line that way, by definition, and especially if you set it as a percentile of the income, you will always have a certain number of poor people with you, right? Because it's going to be a moving target. But nonetheless, such a poverty line can still be useful because it is trying to measure in a way the concept of an income level below which a society believes that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for that person to actually sustain a certain standard of living. The other way of approaching the poverty line problem is to instead define it based on the income or the resources required to attain a standard of living, and for that standard of living in turn to be based on some kind of study that tries to estimate what are the physiological, shelter, and human needs of a person, right? So such studies would typically try to estimate grocery budgets, housing budgets, and so on, and they may adjust the poverty line depending on the cost of living in different areas of the country. So why does Singapore not have a poverty line? You know, if I remember, okay, so again, I'm not going to attribute these arguments to anybody in particular, but I think the usual concerns that policymakers have raised about not wanting to cover poverty line in Singapore is that they would often argue that there are certain elements in the poverty calculation, such as, for example, housing and shelter, which are not, which don't quite look the same way in Singapore as they do in other countries, right? So in Singapore, because of our HDB system, and because of the fact that the majority of the population, including low-income individuals, tend to own their homes, some people might argue that the typical need to try and include some kind of shelter element in the poverty line calculation just doesn't work out very well for Singapore because of all of the other subsidies and programs we have for housing, for example, right? So these arguments sometimes are made that you can't start comparing apples to apples because of the other kinds of government support we have. So I mean, fine, I understand where those arguments are coming from, but at the end of the day, my concern personally is that whether you want to call it a poverty line or something else, I do feel that it is actually the government's responsibility to try to come up with a reasonable measure of basic needs or of deprivation in Singapore, and to not only come up with a measure, but actually to estimate what it is in the population and to track over time whether our policies are making a difference to the measure. I think that's really important, right? And the reason why I think that's important is in my presentation, I showed you that many of us, probably myself included, right, thought that there is no big problem with poverty in Singapore. I mean, of course, we have low-income people, but many of us thought that we did not have widespread food insecurity or homelessness. Well, maybe we don't have widespread homelessness, but that study does show that 1 in 10 Singaporeans is food insecure at some point, which is, I think, quite troubling. So, without official attempts to measure some of these concepts, I think we're always at risk of having an incorrect view of the reality that Singaporeans have. So, that's my view on that.
Thank you. Do we have any more? No more. I think time is up. Okay. with this, thank you very much. Yeah.